All right, I'm Alex Almeida. I'm a product technical marketer on data protection, and we're going to kind of switch gears a little bit and talk a little bit about how you can leverage data protection to survive a lot of the growing cyber attack landscape that you've seen in the news and read about in various articles out there. The key thing here is, and this title of the session is actually appropriately chosen because the key thing here is to recover. Right? It's not to prevent the attacks or talk about how do we stop them in the first place, but it's about recovering. So I'm going to cover a little bit about what that threat environment is, how it's changed over the last several years, and then I'll turn it over to Stefan, who's our product management expert on this, to talk about how you do recovery or some of the high-level do's and don'ts of cybersecurity recovery, and then we'll get into a demo or visualized demo of the data flow on how this is all orchestrated, and Eddie from our engineering team will go through that. So to set the stage, as you guys all have seen in the news, you know, it's in your Twitter feeds, in the social sphere, and you're hearing about it. The attacks are getting more frequent. Ransomware is now becoming an everyday term. There's actually traditional threats in the past where it's been about stealing the data. And stealing the data is one thing, but it never really changed the production aspect of that company that's being attacked. In other words, the production environment has always survived. It's never been about bringing that production environment down. It's always been about stealing the data. So there is a factor that we've always been worried about personal information and protecting personal information. But now it's grown into more of an emerging threat around cyber destruction and cyber extortion, where they're actually locking down manufacturing production, customer production environments and IT environments for financial gain in order to resume production, in terms of ransomware as an example. And some of the cases that we've heard about in the news recently, specifically around a logistics and shipping company, two specific vendors in that case have each lost around $250 to $300 million worth of operations and revenue based on being down from attacks like this. So it's about how do we get the business up and running as quickly as possible. To round out those examples, similarly, a large pharmaceutical provider recently had their manufacturing environment taken down based on these attacks. So it's been a large financial proposition, and there's real money on the table here for those companies, and not just worrying about losing personal data. So they're emerging threats, they're getting, evolving, and now they're also increasing in frequency as well. When we talk about cybersecurity recovery, there's very few regulations that rule the day in terms of what companies should do in order to circumvent these attacks or prevent these attacks in the first place. But the one go-to thing is the NIST cybersecurity framework. And the one thing I want to point out here is that from all of the areas that the NIST framework talks about, the key component here is about recovery. It's about recovering that environment from that resulting attack. And a lot of the details into the Center for Internet Security, for example, always talks about backups, storing several copies of data, even isolating those copies. And that's the level of recovery that we're talking about, and the level of protection that we're going to cover here. Now, everything that we've talked about today plays a part in this. Very early on, Mark, early today, talked about it's all about layered protection. And this is about layered, we talk about it in terms of defenses. So backup and recovery, when we look at traditional data protection best practices, having your DR, having your backup, while that may provide protection from some ransomware attacks, it may not be as good of a protection for, say, from an insider attack. So there's additional architecture and additional layers of protection that you need to put into place in terms of additional hardening of the products that you're implementing, but also deploying advanced protection services like isolated recovery that we're going to talk about today, and that we're talking about here. So it's about a level of protection from a good, better, best scenario, and where is that risk insurance line that you as a customer are looking and we talk about with our customers about where they're comfortable in terms of meeting their business regulations and security capabilities there to protect for the various threats that they have in the landscape. So for this, I'm going to turn it over to Stefan, and he'll go into a little bit of the architecture of the solution.
Thanks, Alex. I have my own mic here, but on to that. Yeah, so I think this was well laid out, and we talked about yesterday and today about technologies that provide that continuum right across that protection, recoverability. This should be very much viewed as this copy of last resort. When we're making the assumption that the bad guys can get in, it's not only nation states, we're very concerned about slow-moving attacks where they do a lot of reconnaissance. And actually, we see a trend where they're actually taking out strategically backup targets because we know that business-critical data is there. They can corrupt it. Maybe they corrupt the backup catalogs. And we also see another trend where, we obfuscate. If we can obfuscate the endpoints and mess with that, it's going to be a lot harder to detect. So we are making the assumption that we have a continuum within the family of Dell technologies. We have fabulous technologies. Recovery plays a key role in this overall security posture. Right? It's not meant to be an endpoint. That's not what we're doing. But we are providing logical separation. And this is where we are bending a little bit our definitions of traditional DR, which we talked about a lot. We talked about SRDF. We talked about the data protection continuum today, which all falls in this realm. So Alex just kind of mentioned one of the case studies. This was one of our customers. Oops, sorry. It's auto-advancing on here. And they got hit by Petya. Okay, like many other customers in Europe, and it was pretty devastating. And the reason why that spread, there's several reasons, but why it spread so quickly, because everything's connected in our digital world, right? So even in this world of disaster recovery, business continuity, we have a connected world. We have to make the assumption that the bad stuff is going to spread. It took down 17 factories. What's that?
I'm going back to tape.
You're going back to tape, and we get that a lot.
Connected to the networker server. Only networker can talk to the tapes.
Yes.
That's it. That's my air gap. I'm going back.
It's funny you bring that up. And this is actually what exactly this company leveraged for purpose of the recovery. So we had 17 factories that were down. And we had backup
I'm
of
only
business.
partially being funny.
No, it's the ultimate air gap, right? The problem that we faced there were a couple of things. One, we didn't have a premeditated recovery plan for this type of attack. So had we known what we do first, second, and last, that would have helped a lot. So we have services geared towards a create a recovery run book, but that's not your traditional DR run book, but that's more augmented for the cybersecurity. The fact that we had tape was good because they actually were able to prioritize the data, pick the business critical stuff, and then perform recovery. The problem is if you just do a stream from the tape at 6 megs, it would have taken weeks.
Oh, tape isn't perfect. It just is protected.
It is protected.
A particular set of problems.
Right. And the challenge is the recovery time. In this case, in their assessment, it would have taken weeks. And they were hemorrhaging essentially 15 million euros of foregone revenue every day, right? So the goal is always, how can I accelerate that? We actually leverage a combination of networker and data domain that we had on site to accelerate that process. Not perfect, but 4.5 days is a lot better. Now, they weren't targeted. It just happened to spread into their environment like other companies that were attacked or that were subject to the attack. Had the attacker gone after the backup target that's online, it would have been a much different story, right? Then it would have been a lot harder to recover.
Well, I mean, just as we were talking about with AWS earlier, I read about ransomware attacks, and some senior executive vice president opened a phishing email, and then the question becomes, why did that senior executive vice president have permission to the backup repository? And It's because he was a senior executive vice president. He said, well, I have to be an administrator. Mm-hmm. And gee, folks, we have to learn how to, it's not even push back. It's give them something that looks like an administrator and hide the fact they can't access the stuff they don't know exists in the first place. The backup repository. Lately, I've been setting up backup repositories where the account administrator has deny ACLs. You have to be the backup.
You have to be,
context.
And when we go into customers and do the audits, we see a lot of these generic housekeeping scenarios, issues around, I don't know why this is always, it's like, hurry up, Stefan.
Somebody built this timer for people who wait to the end for questions.
Folks who have access to storage also have access to backup and so forth. We see that time and time again. There's a lot we can do here. We leverage snaps. We're going to learn more about that. Those are all very, very useful technologies from an operational recovery. Last resort. Okay, so we're doing this, and what we want to do is, so it's all about logical separation versus geographic disparity. So we're not proposing that we're going to buy a data domain and build another data center. That's not needed, but we do want to be very restrictive. It's the brute force attack, I can or approach. I can be very restrictive who I allow access, physical access, and that rules out because 25%, so the guesstimate is insider attack, and that number varies. But even if you are a sophisticated attacker, you're just going to assume the personality. You know, it's possible, not only, it's actually probable that someone will be able to establish a footprint. We may just not know it yet, and then mess with these assets. It's going to be a lot harder. So it's providing a recovery point or restore points with a minimal possible surface of attack is what we're designing for. What we typically want to do, and we've seen two types. We've seen, no, I want everything's important. I just got hacked. I got to put everything in here. It's not practical, I think. We believe that we want to be strategic about what is really the lifeline of your business. We have very nice tools that can give you a dependency map because it's not just your Oracle database and your associated SAP, but it is also foundation services and so forth. So go in, spend some time, and maybe you will find that 10% of the body of what you initially deemed as important really warrants this extra level of, protection, if you will. The other thing that's different, I think, is the definitions around recovery points and recovery times. Where normally here we want it as continuous as possible. I think, knowing this is the last line of defense, we typically see our customers doing a daily synchronization into this IR vault, maybe 4 hours, but there are some exceptions. Mainframe, where every record counts, you might want to have a near continuous pipe. Then you have to figure out how to do additional air gapping kind of within the construct of your isolated recovery vault.
Okay, and you're using air gap metaphorically.
Yeah, I'm using it metaphorically. I knew you were going to, because it is not an air gap, it is a pipe. We do have companies, though, that are looking at data diodes, technologies that's more in line with a real air gap.
Yeah, a firewall would be a better analogy.
Yes, it's a logical, and we'll get through the...
and in fact, frequently that would literally be an internal firewall.
Correct.
Yeah, the air gapping here can take several forms. In fact, we have some customers that we talk to about this that actually have implemented 2 isolated zones, and to increase the air gap in a 24-hour period will literally move from one to the other.
Okay, those of us who have clearance and have actually worked with air gaps continue to object.
Let's walk through a little bit what the underlying technology is, and then I think Eddie will take you through the flow, and then we are applying technology that we have. Because what I should say is, because we are so restrictive around management access, the obvious inference is that there's going to be a strong focus on automation. So sometimes we show, dashboards, or I should say GUIs that make the management easy. Here it's going to be much more important to have an automated workflow unless you want to lock someone in the vault. So we have a fair amount of automation and then exceptions, flagging that I need to intervene. There's something going on, right? That's a little bit different than typically what we design for because we're restrictive. So we got it. So what we have is, as you can see here, we have the data protection appliance, which is the data domain we just talked about. We're making the assumption we're having a data protection software. This is my data domain. This is all in that production environment. And the container that I'm going to refer to here is the M tree or where of this. So this is basically where I write my backup data. I have my backup data and also checkpoints, the metadata of the backup application itself. What then ends up happening is I have this isolated environment. I open the door. In other words, I'm opening the port. I'm synchronizing the data. I'll close the door. We know when the synchronization is over. It's going this way only. And then I go about creating restore points. So I'm leveraging technologies like snaps, fast copies, and these are retention locked, which is valuable on the production side as well. You were shaking your head.
I've got two data domain customers. Their replication never stops.
It never stops.
It never. That's how much data. I mean, they have a lot of data.
Yeah.
They're doing things the wrong way in their backups, right? They're doing a lot of polls. I get all that, but because of that, their replication never stops, so they can't do that.
That is very possible. So sizing is going to be important. If it's so much data,
Exactly.
you may lose the benefit of this bringing the port online and offline. You're still going to have the benefit of being restrictive, right? You have physical security, but obviously you have.
If the link is open, you can. I think the idea is you really want to air gap it.
Yeah,
It's,
of course.
It's I'm just thinking a lot of, and in the big enterprise environments where they're always underfunded in the backup world because nobody likes to fund backup. It's not a production system. They're always scrapping. And so I just don't, and I'm talking, again, 30, 40 petabyte environments, and they're just always going.
We have environments of that size doing this today, and they get it done, but that is a clear consideration. Because what you don't want to have, and it's all about how unique is the data, right? And you know, there's several parameters, but if you're running into that scenario, you're probably trying to push too much into the vault, you know, and then you have that additional risk or surface of attack by having this pipe on too long.
I think more important in that world, in the second data domain, the isolated recovery system has to have a completely separate and differentiated set of credentials than the production. So that even if I think that's just as important. I don't see it, but if you do that, then the credentials they whacked you with on the first one can't necessarily get to the second one.
I would argue the right side of that firewall they're calling an air gap
It completely a separate environment.
isn't even the same Active Directory domain.
No, I agree.
No,
It's not even not
Yes,
the same
I'll get into the details about that when I
gonna
do
get
my
into
part,
the
yes.
But that's an isolated forest, and
Yes.
and you need separate credentials and
Yep.
Exactly.
Hey, there's a weird question. DD support two-factor MFA?
So,
we do CAC
yeah.
cards.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you do MFA with us?
Yeah.
That also helps.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so this is one connection, the data connection. Everything else is restricted with its own credentials. And then essentially we're going to create these restore points. And these are the ones that we would then leverage for two reasons. One, either it's for the recovery. So whenever I have to start going down a recovery path, turn this into a read-write copy, or for purpose of analytics, probably a combination of both. Because the difference is, it's not just you're going to do a standard recovery. Typically, your cyber teams are going to be involved. So what we see customers doing are doing a recovery in another segmented environment, and then they make that environment available to cybersecurity forensics teams and so forth before we unleash it into production, right? So does that make sense? So what doesn't mean you need 6 servers in here. We're just showing that because you are executing everything from within this contained environment, you need to account for compute. You need to account for compute for the management. That is the tools that basically does this automation, this workflow that Eddie's going to lay out. And then, of course, you need some level of compute for purpose of recovery. Now, you don't want to have a like environment necessarily over here, because that would be probably cost prohibitive, but we do have customers who like the idea of having a VX rail or something hyper-converged here to give them enough, ability to scale if they need to. And then certainly if you want to run certain heuristics, analytics inside the vault that are complementary to what you already have in your production domain, you obviously can have compute for that as well, okay?